August 26th, 1346. On a rain-soaked field near the small village of Crécy in northern France, history stood perfectly still. On one side of the field were roughly 9,000 English soldiers. They were exhausted, hungry, and far from home. For weeks, they had marched through hostile territory, burning villages, looting towns, and surviving on whatever they could steal. Now they stood on a low rise of muddy ground, knowing that retreat was impossible. Facing them was something entirely different. More than 30,000 French troops, the greatest army Europe could assemble. Heavy cavalry, armored knights, banners of dukes and counts snapping in the wind. This was not just an army. It was the living embodiment of medieval nobility. The elite of Christendom had come to crush a smaller, weaker enemy. The French believed the outcome was already decided. They outnumbered the English 3-1. Their knights wore the finest armor money could buy. For 500 years, armored cavalry had ruled European battlefields. Infantry existed to be trampled. Archers were an annoyance. Real men, noble men, fought on horseback with lance and sword. Their confidence was so complete that French lords began arguing with one another, not about tactics, but about who would have the honor of killing the English king. Glory was assumed. Victory was inevitable. 4 hours later, the field told a very different story. 1,500 French nobles lay dead in the mud. Princes, dukes, counts, even kings. On the English side, fewer than 40 men had been killed, not 400. 40. In a single afternoon, 5 centuries of armored dominance collapsed. Not because of betrayal, not because of divine intervention, but because common men, armed with wood and string, shattered the very idea of noble warfare. A blind king from Bohemia rode straight into the storm of arrows, refusing to be left behind while others died. French knights panicked and crushed their own infantry as they tried to flee. Genoese mercenaries were slaughtered by the very nobles who had hired them. Cut down for retreating when the situation became hopeless. For days afterward, crows fed so heavily on the bodies of the aristocracy that they grew too bloated to fly, hopping awkwardly through piles of shattered armor and broken banners. This was the Battle of Crécy, the day medieval warfare died in the mud, the moment when the belief that nobility equaled superiority was obliterated by peasant archers. By the end of this story, you will understand how a weapon worth 10 shillings destroyed armor worth 1,000 pounds, why French knights turned on their own mercenaries in the middle of battle, and how the doomed charge of a blind king became one of the most hauntingly tragic deaths in military history. But to understand how the world ended on that muddy slope, we need to step back and see how both armies arrived there. Because Crécy was not an accident. It was the result of arrogance meeting preparation and tradition colliding with reality. The road to Crécy began long before the first arrow was loosed. In the summer of 1346, King Edward III of England landed on the coast of Normandy with an army of roughly 15,000 men. His claim was not modest. Through his mother, Isabella of France, Edward asserted a direct right to the French throne itself. To the French crown, this was an insult. To Edward, it was a declaration of destiny. But Edward did not come to conquer cities or hold territory. He came to break France psychologically. His army began a brutal campaign known as a chevauchée. It was legalized destruction. Villages were burned. Crops were destroyed. Churches were looted. Livestock was slaughtered. The goal was not land, but humiliation. Edward wanted to prove that the French king could not protect his own people. Northern France bled as the English advanced. Smoke rose behind them like a moving horizon. The city of Caen was sacked. Town after town fell into chaos. Refugees fled in terror as English banners passed through the countryside. Every mile Edward marched was a message. France is defenseless. Your king is powerless. Eventually, Edward turned to the north, retreating toward the English-held port of Calais. His men were tired. Supplies were running low. He needed to reach safety before the French could trap him. But the French king had finally responded. Philip VI of France raised the greatest army his kingdom had ever seen. Between 30 and 35,000 men answered his call. Among them were 12,000 heavy cavalry, knights encased in steel, riding armored war horses bred for shock combat. This was not a normal army. Nearly every major noble family in France was represented. Princes and lords from across Europe joined the host. The Holy Roman Empire sent contingents. The King of Bohemia arrived with his court. Even knights from Moravia marched to join the coming slaughter. It was, quite literally, a medieval assembly of champions, an army built on lineage, reputation, and centuries of battlefield dominance. To the French nobility, this was not a war. It was a reckoning, an opportunity to wipe away the humiliation inflicted by English raiders, to destroy Edward III in open battle, to restore honor through steel and blood. They were certain they would succeed. The French knight was the ultimate weapon of his age. A mounted warrior in full armor, combined with his war horse, weighed close to a ton. He had trained for combat since childhood. His armor cost more than an entire village could earn in a lifetime. For 500 years, the thunder of cavalry charges had decided European wars. Infantry existed to support knights, not replace them. Archers were tolerated, not respected. True combat was face-to-face, sword-to-sword, noble against noble. Edward III understood something his enemies did not. The age of the mounted knight was ending. Edward knew he could not outrun Philip forever. His army was too slow, too burdened with loot. Eventually the French would catch him, and when they did, the English would have to fight. So Edward chose his ground carefully. Near the village of Crécy, he positioned his army on rising terrain, forcing the French to attack uphill. He divided his forces into 3 defensive lines, and between those lines he placed his secret weapon, 5,000 longbowmen. They were not knights. They were peasants, farmers, laborers, even criminals, men hardened by years of mandatory archery practice imposed by English law. Every Sunday after church, Englishmen were required to train with the bow. Other sports were banned. Archery was not a hobby. It was a national obligation. The longbow itself was simple, a 6-foot stave of yew wood. No steel, no decoration, but in trained hands it was terrifying. A skilled archer could loose 12 arrows per minute, accurately striking targets more than 200 yards away. The draw weight was immense, often over 100 pounds. The strain warped the human body over time. Archaeologists can still identify longbowmen by their skeletons, their left arms stretched and thickened, their shoulders twisted permanently by years of training. Edward placed these men on the flanks, angled inward, creating overlapping fields of fire. Then he made a decision that stunned his entire army. He ordered his knights to dismount and fight on foot. English nobles, trained for mounted combat, were told to abandon their horses and stand in the mud beside peasants. It was unheard of. It was humiliating. And it was necessary. Edward understood that only the living would keep their honor. That evening, as the French approached, the English camp was calm. Archers waxed their bowstrings to protect them from rain. Stakes were driven into the ground. Trenches were dug by torchlight. Chronicles record that Edward even distributed meat and ale, ensuring his men slept with full stomachs. Across the valley, the French camp glittered with armor and arrogance. Nobles feasted, drank, and argued. Discipline dissolved beneath vanity. The difference between the two armies could not have been sharper. One side prepared for survival, the other prepared for glory, and by the next afternoon, glory would drown in blood. By the afternoon of August 26th, the French army finally reached the heights overlooking the English position. They arrived exhausted. Philip VI's host had marched hard for days, chasing Edward across northern France. Armor chafed, horses were spent, men were hungry and irritable. The sensible decision would have been to halt, rest the army, and attack at dawn with a clear head and a unified plan. Philip VI actually gave that order. He commanded his army to stop. But kings do not always command knights. To the French nobility, patience felt like weakness. They looked across the valley and saw the English standing still, dirty, outnumbered, trapped against the coast. They smelled victory. Every minute of daylight felt like lost glory. Dukes and counts began shouting that the enemy was trying to escape. That delay would rob them of their rightful triumph. Some knights lowered their lances without orders. Others spurred their horses forward, unwilling to be left behind in the race for fame. Philip's command dissolved almost instantly. What had been an army became a crowd of aristocrats, each determined to reach the English first. Discipline collapsed before the first blow was struck. Then the sky darkened. A sudden storm rolled across the field. Rain poured down, soaking armor, clothing, and weapons. To the French knights, the storm meant nothing. Their steel armor would protect them. They laughed and pushed forward, convinced that God himself could not stop them now. To missile troops, the rain meant everything. The English archers quietly unstrung their bows and tucked the cords beneath their helmets and cloaks, keeping them dry. It was a small act of preparation, almost invisible. The Genoese crossbowmen, hired mercenaries fighting for France, were not so fortunate. 5,000 of them formed the French vanguard. They were among the finest crossbowmen in Europe, professionals, veterans. But their crossbow strings, exposed to the rain, stretched and slackened. Their effective range was reduced. Their power weakened. Worse still, their pavises, the large shields they relied on for protection while reloading, had been left with the baggage train far behind the front lines. They were about to walk into death without cover. At roughly 150 yards, the Genoese loosed their first volley. Bolts arced through the rain and fell short. The English line did not move. Then the English replied. 5,000 longbows rose in unison. The sound was described by witnesses as thunder. The sky darkened as tens of thousands of arrows surged forward every minute, slicing through rain and air alike. The Genoese had no shields, no cover. Their crossbows took half a minute to reload. The English longbows needed only seconds. They were erased. Men fell screaming. Bolts lay useless at their feet as arrows punched through flesh and armor. Panic broke the formation. The mercenaries turned and ran, desperately trying to escape the storm of death. And that was when the madness truly began. French nobles, watching the Genoese retreat, did not see a tactical withdrawal. They saw cowardice. One noble reportedly shouted for the knights to cut down the rabble blocking their advance. And they did. Armored French knights spurred forward and rode straight through their own men, hacking down Genoese mercenaries who had nowhere left to flee. Caught between English arrows and French swords, the hired soldiers were slaughtered almost to the last man. In a single moment of arrogance, the French destroyed their own missile troops. The field was now littered with bodies. Blood mixed with rain and mud. Horses screamed. And still the knights charged. 12,000 mounted nobles lowered their lances and began their assault uphill, straight into the teeth of the English longbow. This was the moment medieval warfare broke. At long range, arrows did not always pierce the best plate armor. They did not need to. They found the horses, eyes, mouths, legs. the soft places no armor could protect. A war horse weighing over 1,000 pounds, struck by multiple arrows, did not keep charging. It collapsed, screaming, becoming a wall of flesh that shattered the momentum of those behind it. Knights crashed into fallen horses, lances snapped, formations disintegrated. At closer range, bodkin-tipped arrows punched through visors, armpits, joints, and thighs. Even when they failed to penetrate, the impact was devastating, slamming into steel like a hammer blow, rattling men inside their armor. The French charged again, and again, and again. Each wave climbed over the dead bodies of the last. The English archers fired until the ground around them bristled with spent arrows. When they ran low, they rushed forward, yanked shafts from corpses and wounded men, and fired them back into the oncoming knights. The French were being killed by their own arrows, and still the charges continued. But the most haunting moment of the battle had yet to come. As the battlefield descended into chaos, one figure refused to retreat. John of Bohemia was nearly 50 years old and had been blind for close to a decade. Disease had taken his sight, but not his pride. He had come to Crécy not because he needed to, but because a king of his generation believed that honor was proven only in battle. When his attendants told him the French attack was failing, that knights were dying by the hundreds, and the field was becoming impassable, he gave a simple reply. The King of Bohemia does not flee from battle. Unable to see the enemy, John ordered his knights to tie their reins together so they could guide him forward. Bound horse to horse, they formed a living chain and advanced into the storm of arrows, riding toward sound and shadow. It was not a charge meant to win. It was a charge meant to die with meaning. The group was cut down almost instantly. Horses collapsed. Steel rang against arrows and mud. When John's body was found later, he was still tied to his companions, sword in hand, eyes open. He had fulfilled his final wish. He had struck at the enemy before death claimed him. Even Edward III's son, the Black Prince, was moved by the act. He later adopted John's personal emblem, 3 ostrich feathers, along with the motto Ich dien, meaning I serve. It remains the symbol of the Prince of Wales to this day. But honor could not stop arrows. As evening approached, the French assaults grew more desperate and less organized. By some accounts, the French charged 16 separate times. 16 waves of noble blood thrown uphill into a killing ground they refused to understand. Knights fought each other for position at the front, desperate to be seen, desperate to salvage glory from catastrophe. Many died without ever reaching the English line, sinking into mud so deep they could not rise beneath the weight of their armor. Philip VI himself joined the final assault. His horse was struck down beneath him, and an arrow tore through his jaw. Only his guards prevented him from being killed or captured. The sacred oriflamme, France's battle banner believed to guarantee victory, was abandoned in the mud. As darkness fell, the battlefield fell silent. The English did not pursue. They held their ground through the night, killing any wounded Frenchman who tried to crawl away. Their arrows were long gone. The work was finished with knives, mallets, and wooden stakes. Peasant archers beat armored nobles to death in the dark. When dawn broke on August 27th, the scale of the disaster became undeniable. The flower of French nobility lay scattered across the field. The Count of Flanders, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Alençon, prince after prince, lord after lord. More than 1,500 nobles were dead, along with thousands of lesser knights and men-at-arms. English losses numbered around 40. The imbalance was so extreme that chroniclers refused to believe it, claiming divine intervention. But there was nothing supernatural about Crécy. There was only preparation, discipline, and the brutal mathematics of firepower. Yet the true devastation was not measured in numbers. Medieval warfare had long depended on ransom. Noble enemies were captured, not killed, Wealth was recycled through honor. At Crécy, that system collapsed. English archers did not know names. They did not recognize banners. They simply killed. Dukes died like peasants. Kings fell face first into the mud. And with them died the illusion that noble blood granted superiority on the battlefield. When the sun rose on August 27th, the medieval world finally saw itself clearly. The field below Crécy was no longer a battlefield. It was a mass grave. Bodies lay piled in armor worth fortunes. Horses rotted where they had fallen. Broken lances, shattered shields, and torn banners were half buried in mud soaked black with blood. The silence was unbearable. English soldiers moved cautiously among the dead, stunned by what they had survived. Many could not believe the enemy had truly been destroyed. Others felt no triumph at all, only exhaustion and disbelief. They had held their ground, and the ground had swallowed an entire class of men. The French dead were not nameless. They were the backbone of the kingdom. Counts, dukes, princes, and royal cousins lay face down in the mud. So many nobles had died that there were not enough surviving peers to identify and bury them properly. Bodies were left exposed for days. Armor was stripped. Jewels were pried from cold fingers. Peasants scavenged the dead and became wealthy overnight. Crows and wolves descended in numbers so great that witnesses wrote they darkened the field. The birds fed so heavily on noble flesh that they grew too fat to fly, waddling between corpses like grotesque symbols of an overturned order. For generations, European warfare had operated under an unspoken agreement. Nobles fought nobles. The defeated were captured, ransomed, and returned. War was brutal, but it followed rules shaped by class. Crécy shattered those rules. English archers did not recognize heraldry. They did not care about lineage. To them, a man in armor was simply a target. They fired into visors, into joints, into horses, until nothing moved. For the first time, Europe's ruling class understood something terrifying. They could be killed easily. The psychological shock was immense. France was left without leadership. Entire regions lost their lords in a single afternoon. Governance collapsed. Estates went unmanaged. Power vacuums spread across the countryside. Militarily, the lesson was impossible to ignore. Heavy cavalry was no longer unstoppable. Discipline, positioning, and ranged firepower mattered more than courage or bloodline. The French would be forced to adapt, humiliatingly copying English infantry tactics and raising their own corps of archers. But adaptation came slowly. 10 years later at Poitiers, France would repeat the same mistake. Knights charging uphill into English longbowmen. Another king captured. Thousands more nobles dead. The lesson of Crécy had been written in blood, yet pride refused to read it. The social consequences ran even deeper. If peasants could slaughter nobles, what did divine right truly mean? If a Welsh archer could end the life of a prince with a single arrow, what justified the feudal order at all? Crécy did not merely change how wars were fought. It undermined why society was structured the way it was. Ironically, the longbow itself would not survive forever. It required years of training, discipline enforced over generations. When gunpowder weapons arrived, tools that any man could learn in days, even the longbow became obsolete. The weapon that killed chivalry would soon be killed by progress. Yet one image remained burned into memory. A blind king riding into death because honor demanded it. Knights trampling their own allies in the pursuit of glory. Peasant archers standing calmly as the elite of Christendom fell before them, like wheat beneath a scythe. Crécy was not just a victory. It was a revelation. And Europe would never fight the same way again. Historians do not remember Crécy simply because so many men died there. They remember it because of what died with them. For centuries, European warfare had been built on a single assumption. That war was decided by courage, lineage, and personal valor. That the knight raised from childhood to fight, armored in steel and mounted on a war horse, was the natural master of the battlefield. Crecy proved that assumption was a lie. What mattered was not who you were, but where you stood. Not how brave you felt, but how well you were positioned. Not blood, but preparation. Not honor, but coordination. Edward III did not win because his men were nobler or stronger. He won because his army functioned as a system. Archers supported infantry. Infantry protected archers. Terrain was shaped into a weapon. Every man had a role, and every role mattered. This was something new. For the first time in Western Europe, a battle was decided primarily at range. Before opposing elites ever crossed swords, firepower, not personal combat, became the decisive force. The battlefield became a place of calculation rather than ceremony. In this sense, Crecy was not the end of medieval warfare. It was the beginning of modern warfare. The principles were unmistakable. Defensive positioning could neutralize numerical superiority. Disciplined infantry could defeat aristocratic cavalry. Technology, even simple technology, could overturn centuries of tradition. Later centuries would replace longbows with muskets, cannons, and rifles. But the logic remained the same. Crecy taught Europe that whoever controlled distance, terrain, and coordination controlled the outcome. The French learned this lesson painfully and slowly. At first, they clung to the old ideals. Knights continued to charge. Honor continued to demand sacrifice. And defeat continued to follow. Only after decades of humiliation did France finally reorganize its armies, placing greater value on infantry, missile troops, and command structure. England, for a time, stood at the forefront of this transformation. The English longbowman became the most feared soldier in Europe. His presence alone could alter enemy strategy. Battles were planned around avoiding him, neutralizing him, or outlasting him. But even this dominance was temporary. The longbow required years of physical conditioning and constant practice. It was a weapon built on a culture, not just a design. When firearms emerged, weapons that required weeks instead of decades to master, the age of the archer ended just as abruptly as the age of the knight had. Progress showed no loyalty. Yet the symbolism of Crecy endured. The image of French knights killing their own mercenaries in frustration, of nobles dying anonymously in the mud, of peasants determining the fate of kings. These images haunted Europe's ruling classes for generations. Crecy forced a realization that could never be undone. Power no longer flowed naturally from birth. It flowed from organization, innovation, and discipline. The battlefield had become a mirror, and what it reflected terrified those who had once believed themselves untouchable. Today, the field of Crecy is calm. There is no thunder of hooves, no clash of steel, no banners snapping in the wind. A small monument stands where thousands once died. Most travelers pass without stopping, unaware that beneath their feet lies the grave of an entire worldview. But on August 26, 1346, this quiet hillside witnessed the end of medieval certainty. 5 centuries of military tradition collapsed in a single afternoon. The belief that noble blood guaranteed superiority was shattered by arrows fired by men who owned nothing but their skill. The idea that honor could overcome preparation drowned in rain and mud. The knights who rode that day believed they were immortal within their armor. They believed courage could stop steel. They believed God favored lineage. They were wrong. Crecy proved that courage cannot defeat mathematics, that bravery cannot outrun physics, that nobility cannot stop an arrow traveling 200 yards in 6 seconds. The blind king of Bohemia became the final symbol of that dying age. His charge was not foolish. It was faithful. Faithful to an ideal that no longer belonged to the world he lived in. He rode forward not to win, but because retreat meant admitting that honor was obsolete. When he fell, tied to his knights, sword still raised, an era fell with him. After Crécy, Europe would still speak of chivalry. Tournaments would still be held. Songs would still glorify knights and heroic charges. But on real battlefields, decisions were no longer made by personal valor. They were made by discipline, by positioning, by weapons that did not care who you were. The longbowman did not know the names of the men he killed. He did not care about banners or coats of arms. To him, every armored figure was the same shape, moving at the same speed, vulnerable in the same places. That indifference changed history. France lost more than men at Crécy. It lost faith in the natural order of the world. The realization that peasants could slaughter princes shattered the foundation of feudal certainty. The shock echoed far beyond the battlefield, into courts, castles, and churches, all of it undone by 5,000 men practicing archery every Sunday after church. The medieval world did not end in fire or prophecy. It ended quietly, in the rain, beneath a sky blackened by arrows. And when the crows finally took flight from that field, fat from noble flesh and heavy with silence, they carried with them the last remains of an age that would never return.